All right, everybody, it's time for another episode of the Michael Shermer Show. My guest today is Caroline Fraser, the author of Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder, which we'll discuss a little bit later in the show. But she won the Pulitzer Prize for that, as well as the National Book Critics Circle Award, which is huge, and the Heartland Prize and the Plutarch Award for the Best Biography of the Year. She's also the author of God's Perfect Child. Look, I have the first edition from 1999 about living and dying in the Christian Science Church. Carolyn, when I saw, I saw your name come up with the new book, which I'll introduce properly in just a moment. I thought, I know this woman. I'm pretty sure I read that book. And then I'm looking at the back blurbs, and it's like Michael Shermer, with the brilliant clarity of a talented writer and the thoughtful depth of a serious scholar. Caroline Fraser has documented precisely how Mary Baker Eddy created the cult of Christian Science and turned it into the religion it is today. A must-read for anyone interested in the powerful role of religion in American society. God's Perfect Child is a first-rate work by an insider with the distance and maturity for proper context and perspective. And if you're a Christian Scientist, this book could literally save your life. All right. We'll come back to that a little bit later. I want to give you a proper introduction here. The new book is Murderland, Crime and Bloodlust in the Time of Serial Killers. Wow, what a book. I mean, I have to tell you, I read the book. I listened to the audio. It's a gripping story. You are such a good writer.
Well, thank you.
How did you become such a good writer?
And thank you for that blurb, by the way.
You're welcome. So what's your, just kind of give us a little bit of background, since you do that in the book, because you grew up in this area that you're writing about.
Yeah, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, in a suburb of Seattle, which I talk a bit about in the book. And, during the 1970s, which was the rise of the serial killer phenomenon, when everybody sort of first became aware of it. And that, of course, was my entree to the subject, which I'd been thinking about for years.
Yeah, well, let's just kind of go over the general thesis of the book is that there's a causal link between environmental toxins like lead, copper, and arsenic and violent crime. Not just serial killers, but all kinds of violent crime, but especially those. Just as a kind of a review, I just put together a short list of the people you deal with in the book. The want ad killer, Harvey Corrigan. Sorry, the boxcar killer, Robert Joseph Silveria Jr., the lust killer, Jerry Brudos, the phantom sniper, Gary Taylor, the Hillside Stranglers, apparently plural, Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono Jr., the Lewiston Valley Killers, which I guess we don't know who they are, the I-5 killer, as in Interstate 5, I guess he was patrolling there, Randy Woodfield, the coin shop killer, Charles Sinclair, the dismemberment murderers, he got these names, the index killer, I think we don't know who that is, right? The grocery bag killer, Robert Lee Yates Jr., the happy face killer, Keith Hunter Jasperson, the East Side killer, George Waterfield Russell, the werewolf butcher of Spokane, Jack Owen Spillman, the beast of British Columbia, Clifford Olson, the Green River killer, Gary Ridgway, the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez, plus Ted Bundy, Charles Manson, Hannibal Lecter, and Buffalo Bill. Oh, I added those two from fiction. But, after I read your book, I realized how much of The Silence of the Lambs came out of these stories.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and I think that that the author has talked about that, that he has, Thomas Harris has talked about, Ted Bundy and a bunch of other killers who he learned about through talking to people at the FBI profiling program. And he sort of took bits and pieces from these various people to create those characters. But, the real stories of these guys are, if anything, even more horrific than what he was writing about.
Yeah, like with the case of Buffalo Bill, where he's got his arm in a fake cast and he's trying to move a couch into the back of his van, just as the victim, a potential victim, walks by and acts like he needs help, and then she's a generous person. Apparently, I forget, was it Bundy who did that?
Yes, he often faked injuries and asked women to help him. do stuff like put things in his car, and then he
Yeah.
would hit them over the head.
And then cutting them up and torturing them and so on. Yeah. So let's just think about the kind of violence that's going on here that's so different from most violent crime. I mean, we know from sociological studies, Donald Black, for example, documents that about 90% of homicides are moralistic in nature. Not instrumental, like I killed him to get his Rolex, but he took my parking spot, or he embarrassed me in front of my girlfriend, or he cheated in pool. These are the kinds of things where the perpetrator feels the victim deserves the capital punishment for what they did. But what you're writing about, this is completely different. These people are really sick.
Yeah, and I think it's important to realize that the majority of serial killer crimes arise from sexual gratification. These are guys who are getting gratification from murder. They get off on this, and that's why they do it. And I think that that's uh, uh, one of the things that has been kind of, um, in the press, for example, for many decades. um, the media kind of shied away from talking about that because they couldn't go into a lot of detail, or they felt constrained in talking about some of that stuff. And so people got, I think, misleading ideas, both from the media coverage, but then also from the kinds of books and novels and films that you're talking about, because it's interesting to note that in so many movies, like The Silence of the Lambs, um, they're not portraying these crimes as sexual in nature. They're portraying them as being committed by somebody who's just fiendishly clever, sort of a genius of murder. And I think that that does some disservice to the facts in the sense that, I think it's important to understand that these crimes are sexual, and then to ask the question, okay, what went wrong with these guys that made them have these urges?
Yeah, it's like I don't know. Some people are into bondage and sadomasochism and that sort of thing. But this goes way beyond that. Like, I kept her alive, I raped her, then I strangled her till she passed out, but I didn't want to kill her. And then I raped her again, and then I strangled her again till she passed out, and I did this for 3 days, and then, I stabbed her to death. It's like, what? This is
Yeah.
so different from other crimes.
Yeah, I mean, sexual gratification from torture, but then also, as we saw with several of these notorious killers in the Northwest, necrophilia,
Mm.
um, where these guys are having sex with the dead bodies of their victims, sometimes days after they were murdered, which is so horrifying, so impossible to talk about in many, instances in terms of, the coverage of this, again, as I said. But I think it's important to see those extremes, because the extremes show you that something may have gone terribly wrong with the brains,
Hmm.
or the neurological development of the
Hmm.
people who do this.
So your thesis is correlating the rise in these environmental toxins post World War II, and this spike roughly 20 years later in the 70s. So say the industrial pollutants start ramping up in the 50s, and then 20 years later, these guys that were raised in this are coming of age and starting their criminal activity.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that, I do talk a little bit about other things that may have contributed to this as well. I sure, yes, I am suggesting this as a theory, but I'm also bringing in some other biological or neurological problems that may have contributed to this, including, head trauma, A lot of in the 1950s, a lot of kids were born with the use of forceps, which caused
Hmm.
damage to the cranial um, uh, capacity of the kids, or physical abuse, sexual abuse. Those are things that the FBI has spent a lot of time looking at with these killers, and rightly so, I think. Um, and there are also, genetic factors that may be involved. There are certain genes that have been identified as associated with aggression, the so-called warrior gene, which I think has been perhaps a little oversimplified in the media, but those things exist and are being studied. And diet is a huge factor. That's why women are now counseled to take prenatal vitamins. If babies are deprived of certain nutrients, and vitamins and things, and their neurological development can be affected. So I think there's a lot of things that we can look at now with the brain, and lead is just one of them. But I think it's pretty clear from all the studies that have been done, um, showing the association of lead exposure to aggression and violence, that lead does not help. I mean, lead is really a factor in, um, reducing the capacity of people, and also causing all kinds of other diseases in the body. It is not just associated with crime, it's associated with heart disease and um, ALS and all kinds of other problems. So one of the things I was hoping to do is just show people a lot of this research that's been ongoing. Um, Not just to kind of prove a point or to try to prove a theory, but to help people understand why lead is such a bad thing in the environment.
Hmm. Yeah, you have these graphs. I'll just show them up here so when people get the book, they can look at them in more detail of showing these correlations and the corridor in the Pacific Northwest. Very strong correlation. I do think you make a pretty strong case, but let's just think about it this way. Like I had Rachel Toles on the show last year. She's touring with a show, a one-person show, and about serial killers. Her thesis is that they were all abused as children, sexually, physically, and so on. But it may be the same causal connection you're talking about, brain damage of some kind, or just psychological damage. And that's also what Adrian Raines found. His book, Anatomy of Violence.
Right.
You probably read that book. So, this is the guy that pioneered taking a portable MRI brain scanner to prisons and scan the brains of these serial killers and murderers and, really bad hombres. And, to a man, and they're pretty much all men, their prefrontal cortex was basically quiescent. It was just shut down. There was no break. But then as I was reading that, I was thinking, well, I don't have the impulses bubbling up to do these things for which I need a break, right? So is it a break or is it an accelerant? Where do these ideas come from in the first place? How would lead or being physically abused or being dropped on your head or whatever, crappy nutrition, poor neighborhoods, and so on, how would that, trigger these thoughts of these, sick, twisted sexual deviancies?
Well, from the FBI profiling program, they know that these things start very early in a lot of these guys. They start when they're kids. And that too is something that you see with lead exposure. You see problems with behavioral, um, you know, elements. You see kids sort of attacking other kids, or you see them setting fires, or you see them, um, acting out in ways that are inappropriate. So I think that argues to some kind of uh, brain involvement. There's some developmental issues that are showing up quite early. So you kind of wonder, is something getting is the wiring wrong in some of these guys? And yes, I think physical abuse and sexual abuse are big um, predictors of this kind of violence, and yet many, many, thousands, millions of people have suffered some form of that and don't become serial killers. So then I think we have to ask, is there are there lots of things that are happening to the kids who become, the most extreme examples of this? Maybe they have the genetic issue. Maybe they also have lead exposure. Maybe they also have trauma, domestic violence, abuse, poor diet, etc. But there are interesting exceptions to this, and that I think you see with somebody like Ted Bundy, because we have no evidence that he had physical or sexual abuse in the home. He seems to have had a fairly good home life. They were poor, to be sure, but we don't see some of these things. He seems to have been quite intelligent in some ways, quite cunning. Um, as opposed to somebody like Dennis Rader down in Wichita, Kansas, the BTK killer. He um, often seems, when you read his accounts of why he did things or how he did things, to be mentally impaired in some way. He went to college, surprisingly, but he doesn't really seem like somebody who went to college. He seems like somebody with a kind of a sixth grade mentality. So there's a whole range of behaviors with these guys, and so I don't think all of these factors necessarily explain everything. But I think it's probably true that some of the worst of these guys did have multiple factors, including lead.
Yeah. Here's how I think about it. All these kinds of hypotheses is I think of a 2x2 grid. So just picture a box with two lines across it, and you have four cells. So in cell number one up here, you have serial killers who grew up and lived in toxic environments. Then you have here serial killers who grew up and lived in non-toxic environments. And then cell three, non-violent people who grew up and lived in toxic environments, like you. You grew up in this horrible corridor you talk about, and you're not like that. Or number four, nonviolent people who grew up and lived in non-toxic environments. Okay, so the question is, how do we think about the exceptions? How do we control for those? Nothing in human behavior has a single cause. Everything is multi-causal.
Sure.
And so you're going to have, maybe half a dozen to a dozen different things at work at the same time. Really hard for social scientists to control it. This is why I think we'll never be able to predict who serial killers will be, or the next school shooter. It was the trans guy. Well, okay, but I don't think the trans had anything to do with it. I think he was a mentally ill, disturbed young man, of which the trans, I'm talking about the Minneapolis shooting last week. I just think there's multiple factors at work there, including randomness. I think there's an element. Maybe Ted Bundy, just something happened when he was a child. He went left instead of right, or he had the upper bunk instead of the lower bunk, or a dog barked at him, or who knows? There was probably a bunch of stuff no one knows, and even the best profilers, there's just no possible ways. Like, where's the next terrorist attack going to come from? I mean, the terrorists themselves may not know to the last minute what they're going to do. The school shooter may not know until like this morning I got up and decided today's the day. I always talk about these examples like suicides. The people that try to commit suicide, they fail, and then they're interviewed. And mostly they say, I don't know, something just came over me that morning. I've been depressed and this and that, and then I just snapped, and that was it. I don't know. I have no idea why. And I think of a lot of it as like that.
Yeah, I'm sure there's some truth to that. I mean, to take one element of what you just mentioned in your grid, one of the reasons why I wanted to include the material about Mercer Island, where I grew up, is that Mercer Island was in the plume from the Tacoma smelter, which was putting out all this lead and arsenic during the 60s and 70s and had been for decades. And I wanted to show how during this period when I was growing up, this place, which was fairly well-to-do, it was a largely white, largely
Yeah, you have a nice
middle
pictures of it
class.
there.
Right,
All the
there's
Tacoma.
the Tacoma
Yeah.
smelter, and so but Mercer Island was getting some of that too, and this place that should have been, uh, one would expect, based on just its demographic, to be fairly safe, to be, a kind of an unremarkable suburb in terms of violence, became a little more violent than it should have been. There was more crime, especially among the, teenagers. There was all this concern about drugs, which there should have been because there were in fact, a lot of drugs being consumed at the high school and so forth. There was a lot of accidents involving dangerous driving, but there were also some of the really strange episodes that correlate in a way to the kinds of violent crime I'm talking about in the book. There was, in fact, a serial killer who grew up on the island down the street from me, George Waterfield Russell, who was a kid who had, some issues growing up, but nothing that would really predict who he would become. And he ends up murdering 3 women on the east side in Bellevue and so forth in 1990. And that struck me as quite strange for a place like Mercer Island, as well as all the other kind of mayhem that was going on there when I was growing up. This guy who was in my class in high school who dropped out and later blew up his ex-girlfriend's dorm at university in a kind of a stalking incident. The guy who drove 100 miles an hour into the junior high school gymnasium, you know, under the influence of what? I mean, I don't even know. So, there were these episodes of real aggression, violence, out of control behavior at that time that you don't see now. And that seemed to me to make an interesting story, if nothing else. Um, and and I think that way about a lot of these things that, look at the 1970s, look at what was going on, look at the rise of societal violence, of the number of bombings, for example, in the mid-70s, infamous abductions like Patty Hearst. I mean, there was just a lot of stuff going on that really was overwhelming, I think, to people in society. And I think we can now look at that period from a distance. We can look at it as a historical phenomenon and try to come up with reasons why that might have happened. And I'm sure there are many reasons um,
Yeah.
that go into that.
I do think you've done more than just write a story. I think it's a reasonable hypothesis to add lead, arsenic, and the other environmental toxins into the formula of trying to understand human behavior. Just going through, let's kind of do an overview. Well, let me actually first back up. So if you think about like how a social scientist thinks about these things, an operational definition. What is a serial killer? I mean, the FBI must have an official definition. Like a mass public shooter, you have to kill 4 or more besides yourself to be in that box rather than just some other category. A serial killer, is it something like that?
Yeah, I mean, the Department of Justice says that it's anybody who kills 2 people or more in separate incidents, separate occasions, whereas a mass shooter, that's one event. So a mass shooter may kill, 2 people or 20 people or whatever, but they do it once. Whereas a serial killer is uh, killing people in separate instances and there can be different kinds of serial killers themselves. There's now a feeling that there's organized killers versus disorganized killers, and the disorganized would be somebody like who's maybe in the middle of some kind of flagrant mental illness. Episode of mental illness, like somebody who is suffering from schizophrenia and is hearing voices and that tell him to go kill somebody down the street.
Son of
And
Sam. The dog told me.
well, yeah, Son of Sam is controversial because we don't know if the dog story is really true or not, but
Oh, that might have been a bullshit story he just told.
it may have been, yeah. So, yeah, but you can see that some instances of serial killing are just completely somebody who's really out of control and is doing very, bizarre things and murdering people. Whereas the organized killer, somebody like Ted Bundy, is spending a lot of time following people, planning the event, and uh, sometimes killing spontaneously. I mean, Ted Bundy did pick up a lot of hitchhikers, for example, and just kill them off. He hadn't planned it. He didn't know them. He just picked them up and did it. But he also identified various victims in advance and set out specifically to murder them. And you see this too with somebody like Dennis Rader in Kansas.
You know that joke about the guy that picks up a hitchhiker and they're driving down the street and the driver says, aren't you a little nervous? What if I was a serial killer? And the guy, the passenger goes, well, I figure what are the odds of there being two in the car at the same time?
No, I had not heard that.
Yes, it's pretty sick. No one hitchhikes anymore. I mean, when you and I were growing up, I think we were roughly the same age. Hitchhiking was a thing. You just go out there and stick your thumb out and people pick you up. I mean, nobody does that anymore. It may even be illegal. I don't know. But okay, so, so back to our social science. So there's a spike in the number of serial killers. But my first question is, the Department of Justice or the FBI, were they keeping the same kind of track of these things, say, in the 1930s, 40s versus 50s and 60s? In other words, is the spike due to there's actually more of them, or is it more that are being recognized and they just weren't recognized back, say, in the 20s and 30s or 40s?
Yeah, I mean, I forget which year the FBI begins compiling and publishing crime statistics, but it's with J. Edgar Hoover for sure, and who, of
30s,
course,
I think.
yeah. So it doesn't go very far back in terms of the collection of violent crime statistics, and to my knowledge, the FBI has not been publishing a breakdown of the number of serial killers by year. I mean, their figures, their statistics on crime and violent crime are fairly limited. They look at rape, murder, violent crime, meaning any attack, physical attack on a person. But they're kind of, their statistics are kind of a blunt instrument. They don't do a lot of interesting things with with their statistics. And you have to look to other sources to look, for example, at the number of serial killers. There is a university in Florida that has a program on forensic crime and has published the number of serial killers. There's a university professor up in Toronto, I think, who does some of this as well. But those are the people you have to look to actually find the number of serial killers, which, I think does suggest that this whole field is a little complicated in terms of academia. It's not a field that has been in existence for very long. You see, there are some, people out there who've published a lot and have a lot of, good work out there, but it's a very volatile field of study, I think, and one that is not completely gelled.
Yeah. The same thing with the decline, because you also show correlations when, unleaded gasoline leaded gasoline was banned. We got unleaded gasoline, and the, Clean Air Act and all the other government agencies that started cleaning up these rivers and neighborhoods and these toxic waste dumps that they spent millions on cleaning up, and then regulations on factories from pouring these pollutants into the environment. So all of that was also going on, when the decline happened. Okay, that's good, but then, as you know, because you discussed the Freakonomics theory of the decline of decline of violence, which starts around 1993. But there's a bunch of different things going on, in terms of better policing, harsher, stricter sentences for criminals. And, so there's a huge body of literature trying to tease these things apart. It is a really hard problem to explain.
Yeah.
And then it's politicized. The left says, well, this is why. And the right says, no, this is the reason. So that complicates it.
Yeah, for sure. One of the early journalists who uh, became very interested in the lead crime hypothesis was a guy named Kevin Drum, who wrote a lot of stuff for Mother Jones about lead crime, and he picked up on the work of Rick Nevin, who's, you held up the book a few minutes ago and showed that graph. That's Rick Nevin's graph.
I see.
And so Kevin Drum had written a lot of stuff about this, and he unfortunately died earlier this year, which I was really sorry to see, because I would have been interested to hear his opinion of my book. But he became really, yeah.
So it's basically 1930s to 2023. You see the decline, rise and decline of both these lead toxins. By the way, that was another point in your book. That's like the acceptable level of lead in a child's blood. It's like, what?
Yeah.
Acceptable?
Yeah.
And shouldn't it be zero?
Yes, exactly. And Kevin Drum, got onto this history and did a lot of reporting about it, and was really astonished that, the students of crime had kind of not been paying a lot of attention to this. But he began by positing that maybe lead was associated with around 90% of the rate of violent crime in the 70s and 80s. And he later revised that to suggest maybe it's around, 20 to 50%. And I think that's still a kind of work in progress. We're still, as you say, trying to tease apart what causes what, and what was responsible for what. But it was absolutely appalling to me to learn about the history of lead in our society, and the fact that it was legal for all these, companies, Standard Oil and DuPont and so forth, to sell leaded gas to the American people for decades, essentially running this kind of grotesque experiment on the population. And doctors at the time in the 1920s told them, don't do this. It's a really, really bad idea. And they went ahead and did it anyway. And so, yes, everybody who was born, between the 1940s and 50s and around 1980 was exposed to more lead than we should have been. And that's not a good thing for anybody's health, regardless of what you think about crime.
Weren't there theories about the fall of the Roman Empire linked to lead? Because they drank out of lead cups and that kind of thing, lead plates?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that historians have looked at that and looked at the lead lining of their water system and so forth. Um, and I think it's controversial. I think there are some people who think it was related, it was one factor, but there were many other reasons why Rome fell.
Yeah,
Which it did over, course of many, many years. It wasn't just like one,
right.
1 year it all fell apart. But
But
um,
certainly the spike in industrial pollutants, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, is very real post World War II. I just was making a short list just in the A's in your index. American Smelting and Refining Company, American Brake Shoe Foundry, Amalgamated Copper Company, Anaconda Copper Mine, Bunker Hill Mine and Smelting Complex. I mean, there's just like dozens and dozens of
yeah.
these. What were they doing? Why did we need all this these products and how did that all come about? Why did the government do something about it?
Well, I mean, they were absolutely necessary in the sense that, like the generations of people who cut down the forests across the country. We needed that. We needed those raw materials. And the raw material that was produced by ASARCO, for instance, that's the American Smelting and Refining Company, which was owned by the Guggenheim family. They were part of a huge industry that was running what they call primary smelters, which were, I mean, most big cities had um, one or more of these. Philadelphia had many of them. Um,
Pittsburgh.
and the primary smelters were essentially, converting the raw material that came out of mines, the rocks that contained all different kinds of metals, into these refined forms of metals. They were converting rocks into copper and gold and silver and um, all kinds of other uh, metals and chemicals, including arsenic. Arsenic was used and produced pretty heavily in Tacoma at their smelter there as an element of pesticides. Uh, and these things were used in, fruit orchards in Washington State, which also now is a region that has its own plume, Wenatchee, Washington, because of the use of those pesticides. But they were used all over the country on cotton and other things. And so we have lost sight, I think, of what these primary smelters did because they no longer exist uh, in most places. They were all shut down, um, mainly in the 1980s when the Tacoma plant was closed in 1986, because there was a combination of economic factors, but also the creation of the EPA and the Clean Air Act legislation made it almost impossible for them to operate in this country. And so most of that was moved overseas or to South America, Peru, and so forth. So there are countries like China that had in the years since the 1980s uh, built up large capacity in those industries with lead pollution, and as a result, and I think they've really struggled to try to clean up their act because it seems we don't know as much as we would like to about places like that because they don't have a free press, they don't have a justice system that we can follow in any coherent way. But I think probably some of the problems that we had with lead pollution, China then also had later on in history. Um, but basically, all these smelters closed down. I think there are only 3 primary smelters operating in the U.S. right now, 2 in Arizona and 1 in Utah. Um, but we still have what are called secondary smelters, which are the outfits that take in like your car battery. If your car battery dies and you take it into, auto shop or whatever, they end up being recycled at these secondary smelters, which again are separating out these streams of metals, the lead, the copper, etc., which are valuable and need to be recycled. But the process of separating them and removing them from batteries and other things is itself a pretty hazardous uh, project, and something that exposes workers to lead poisoning and also communities, because there's a certain amount of air and water pollution that goes along with that.
My friends in the home construction industry tell me they put chain link fences around the construction sites because people go in there at night and steal the copper wires.
Right.
And so it's like, oh, I had no idea there was a market for that. A black market, apparently. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I can only imagine what all the computer waste is going to pile up as the decades go on. I mean, just think of like, I don't know, every 3 years or so I get a new computer. Where does the old one go? Or the new phone? Where does the old one go? I guess they're in big piles
there's
somewhere.
a fascinating book about that called Waste Wars, that talks about the really atrocious practice of sending that stuff overseas, because there is no real way to safely recycle those materials, especially plastics. We're starting to hear almost every day now in the media about the danger of plastics and plastic particulates and how they're in all of the organs of our bodies. And, the pollution is horrific. But, a lot of that stuff is sent to countries in Africa, for example. There was a notorious place in Ghana, I think, where this stuff was being melted. People were basically just burning it and trying to strip out the copper, but burning the plastic to get at it. So the kinds of things that we've created for ourselves with the technology that we have is a really, really terrifying problem. And I think we're going to have to grapple with it.
Yeah. Well, right. So we create new technologies because we want to continue making progress economically and technologically and so on. That creates problems. So we have to solve those with new solutions and new technologies, which create more problems. This is sort of David Deutsch's The Beginning of Infinity. It just goes on forever. There's always going to be problems and then solutions to problems. I just had Isabel Bemke on the show. She's a Brazilian fashion model turned nuclear energy activist and influencer. if you can believe there's such a job. So after you go into being a fashion model, then you turn to nuclear energy. But she makes a strong case. We need nuclear in the equation along with the other renewables and so on. Anyway, but that just solves the one problem. What you're talking about is the creation of products like brake pads, for example, and copper for electric wires and whatnot. Okay, so let's go. So you also talked about Jessica Wolpaw-Reyes, who did her PhD dissertation at Harvard in economics, and she was inspired by Stephen Levitt's abortion thesis for the crime decline, which begins in about 1993. So kind of talk about her work and then what the actual connection is, we think, between these toxins and what it does to the brain and violence.
Yeah, she was quite important in kind of looking at this early on, looking at the lead quotient in terms of crime. She was, a grad student. She was living in old housing in Cambridge and was pregnant, I guess, and just kind of looked around her and was like, wow, this is not a great environment in which to bring up a child if there's lead paint and so forth. And she came up with this way of contacting various counties around the country and asking what kinds of contributors they may have, what their lead readings were, and using that to create a database of how, you know, depending on the lead in the air in a specific county, and the crime rate in that county, could we look at that and develop a kind of a study that would show what the contribution of lead might have been to that, and really kind of put that on the map in terms of, um, this is how you can look at this. This is how you can separate out some of the noise from various other issues and look at the correlation between lead and crime. So she was very important in doing that. And then I think others picked up on that and began to explore that in greater detail, like Rick Nevin, who um, looked not only at our country, but created a whole series of graphs for other countries that had leaded gas as well, and looked at the rise of violent crime uh, when leaded gas was available, and then also tracked the drop-off in crime when it was when leaded gas was removed, which often took, 10 to 15 to 20 years.
These are like European countries?
Yes, many of them were European countries, Australia, New Zealand, um, developed countries, but almost every country was using leaded gas. I mean, I talk a little bit about the importance of World War II in leading to this problem because, obviously in the war effort, it was incredibly important to be able to have um, fuels that worked well in airplanes. And you had a huge increase in all of these, um, forms of transportation, tanks, trucks, jeeps, everything. I mean, the extraordinary amounts of fuel that were used in World War II um, led to a kind of explosion of this sort of population in that period of the war that I think that the planet had never seen before. And ever since then, we've had, real increase in all of the stuff. I mean, when you think about the 1950s and how many people acquired cars, in the US, I mean, not just one car, but now families were having two cars, and people were commuting to work long distances. And so the driving increased um, to an extraordinary extent over, say, earlier, decades like the 1920s or 30s when not that many people had a car or could afford to drive it for a long distance. So, I think something really notable happened because of the war years and many of these Superfund sites that had to be dealt with in the 70s and 80s trace back to World War II.
Yeah, like most guys my age, I consume as much stuff as I can on World War II. Hitler in color. But yeah, when you look at the numbers, I mean, Japan and Germany had no chance of winning ever. The moment the United States enters the war and you start to look at the production numbers, like B-17s, the Boeing, bomber, Flying Fortress. I saw a number like 33,000 of them. I mean, it's just a staggering number. They can shoot down as many as they want every day. It doesn't matter. We're just going to keep pouring them in there. And there's these little countries, they can't compete. I mean, it's just
and
how many
think
bullets,
of all the metal that went into that,
yes, right.
of all kinds, lead, copper, etc. I mean, absolutely necessary to win the war. But it left a lasting legacy that we are still dealing with.
Oh, yeah. Well, I grew up in Southern California in the La Crescenta, La Cañada area, sort of north of Pasadena in LA. And in the 60s, because I was a pretty active athletic boy, I had asthma. So for the longest time, I was like, well, I guess I just have this genetic thing. I get asthma. It wasn't that at all. It was the smog. And even when I became a bike racer in the 1980s, I had to pretty much be done with my training rides by 10 in the morning, like during the spring and summer. Or else if you're out till noon or 1, your lungs are just fried. You could barely breathe. And that's all changed thanks to the Clean Air Act and the catalytic converter and whatever else did that. And so what was it like growing up in the Pacific Northwest? What were some of your experiences?
Yeah,
Pollution-wise?
this is completely anecdotal and I can't prove it, but I do feel that there have been real changes, both to the air quality since the closure of the smelter, and also some, I'm sure there's a factor here of climate change because uh, I remember in the 60s and 70s it being, summers being shorter. and um, and also just there was an air quality issue. I think that the smelter contributed to it, and undoubtedly traffic, because a lot of people were commuting. They were driving from the east side into Seattle or whatever, and it created a certain amount of smog, and so skies were grayer. I say at one point in the book the sky was the color of lead because it was full of lead. And I think that that's true. Uh, I'm and to some extent, I think you can prove it because there are some statistics that support that I cite. Um, and I thought this was, sort of fascinating corollary to this, which was the whole Jack the Ripper story about the kind of smog that they had in England, in London, during that era of the Industrial Revolution, when there were lots of plants and homes were burning coal and other really dirty stuff, and they were creating all this smog, which we, romanticized as fog. A lot of 19th century writers like Dickens, are describing that pollution, but they call it fog, and so you think it's somehow something that's coming in off the ocean. It's not. It was created.
Yeah, there was a PBS documentary Frontline episode last week, I think, on the Clean Air Act, history of the Clean Air Act. And they have footage from Los Angeles in like the late 40s, early 50s, where you couldn't even see across the street. It was just so bad, and people's eyes are watering and they can barely breathe. Astonishing. It wasn't that long ago.
Yeah, and I'm not sure when that started in Los Angeles, but I did come across some um, newspaper articles from that period that seemed to suggest that a lot of it began during the late 30s and 40s as a part of the war effort. There were chemical companies and so forth that began, producing a lot of stuff as a result of the war that began to produce some of the first instances of really, notable and probably dangerous smog.
Yeah. I'm in Santa Barbara now, but along the ocean corridor here, which is our beautiful beaches and so on, if you look at photos from like the 1920s and 30s, there's like hundreds of oil rigs right on the beach, right
Oh,
out in the ocean.
yeah.
Yeah. It's astonishing. Yeah, I think a lot of that in sort of East LA and that whole kind of Redondo beach area and so on, where there were a lot of manufacturing plants there. So it probably contributed to it. Yeah, it's just in terms of the health. Okay, so what else did I want to bring up? Okay, let's talk about, so the decline starts in 93. I mentioned that. Let's talk about the Freakonomics theory because you deal with that. So the theory is that Roe v. Wade is passed in 72, right? Or 73? 72. Sorry. And so the thesis is that women who would have had unwanted children, who then would have grown up to be more likely to be criminals 20 years later, aborted those fetuses, and therefore crime declines in starting around 1993, 20 years after Roe. That's the thesis.
Yeah, and I think that has been questioned or debunked in some ways. I can't tell you exactly what the major contributor of the debunking was, but yeah, I mean, on the face of it, it seems kind of plausible, but I think that on certain levels, it kind of fell apart a little bit. And now, one of the things that Rick Nevin looked at that I thought was interesting was he wasn't just looking at male violence. He also developed some graphs that show the rise of teen pregnancies during the 70s and 80s, the same period when violent crime really took off. And he attributes that to the kind of impulsivity that's shown by men who may have been exposed to a certain amount of lead as kids. And we've also seen that teen pregnancy issue really drop off. That isn't the big problem that it was in that era. So abortion, I mean, obviously, I think in the sense that, number of kids that might have been born that were not wanted may have been born to people who couldn't afford an abortion, for example, or didn't have access. That's an issue that I would wonder about too.
I'll read you from a little section from Pinker's book, Better Angels of Our Nature. Any hypothesis that comes out of left field to explain a massive social trend with a single overlooked event will almost certainly turn out to be wrong, even if it has some data supporting it at the time. Then he does show that Levitt and his co-author Stephen Dubner, do make some interesting correlational studies. For example, he showed that the handful of states that legalized abortion before 1973 were the first to see their crime rates go down. But these statistics compare two ends of a long, hypothetical, and tenuous causal chain. The availability of legal abortion as the first link and the decline in crime 2 decades later as the last, and ignore all the links in between. So, and then I'll just read a paragraph here. To begin with, the Freakonomics theory assumes that women were just as likely to have conceived unwanted children before and after 1973, and that the only difference was whether the children were born. But once abortion was legalized, couples may have treated it as a backup method of birth control and may have engaged in more unprotected sex. If the women conceived more unwanted children in the first place, the option of aborting more of them could leave the proportion of unwanted children the same. In fact, the proportion of unwanted children could even have increased if women were emboldened by the abortion option to have more unprotected sex in the heat of the moment, but then procrastinated or had second thoughts once they were pregnant. This might help explain why in the years since 1973, the proportion of children born to women in the most vulnerable categories, poor, single, teenage, and African American, did not decrease as the Freakonomics theory would have predicted. It increased, and by a lot. Anyway, then he goes on and on with several more criticisms of it, but it just shows how difficult it is to find these causal connections there.
Yeah, and I suppose also if you go back far enough in history, everybody was unplanned, if not
Yes,
unwanted.
Yes.
Because I mean, abortion has probably been around for a very long time, but I think only in more recent times did it become safe enough
Yes.
to have an effect of that nature. But
well, worse before was infanticide rates were high, much higher.
Yeah.
So it's just after birth, then you get rid of them that way. There's those horror stories in England of unwanted babies in trash bins and in parks, middle of the night, that sort of thing. Just terrible. Or those foundling homes where these young unmarried women would go and drop off, have their baby and then leave, and they'd do whatever they did with them.
Yeah, the notorious laundries in Ireland and so forth. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right. Okay, so I was just going to read a section here. Back to the serial killers and what there may not be enough of them. In other words, the database may not be big enough to generalize, but it does seem some of them were kind of proud of what they did. You were writing in the last chapter here, the fog warning, about the guy that he gave like a 19-hour after he was captured. He gave like a 19-hour deposition about what he did, and he was kind of proud of how he did it all. I forget who that was. Was that the
Yeah, I
Israel
think
Keys?
that might have been Dennis Rader
Oh, Dennis
or
Rader. Oh, right.
yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, it's just so weird. So this guy, Israel Keys, I'll just read this just because it's hard to believe what they're like. On the night of February 1st, 2012, around 8 p.m., Israel Keys is driving down a street in Anchorage when he sees a girl working alone in a coffee hut on the edge of a parking lot. It's Samantha Koenig. She's 18, a senior in high school. She has an oval face framed by long, gleaming brown hair. He orders an Americano, and when she hands it to him, he pulls out a gun and plucks her like a piece of fruit. First, he tells her it's a robbery. He orders her to turn off the lights, which she does. It's closing time anyway. She hands him all the cash in the register. He tells her to go down on the floor, and she complies. He vaults himself through the open window, ties her up with zip ties, gets her to swear that she hasn't hit a panic button, and stuffs her mouth with napkins. As he's marching her to his truck parked at the IHOP nearby, she briefly breaks away, but he tackles her and presses her gun into her side, his gun. He'll kill her if she tries to escape again, he says. He straps her into the truck and pulls the napkins out of her mouth. Driving off, he tells her he's holding her for ransom. That's true, but it's not the whole truth. For Israel, there's a time crunch. He's scheduled to leave within hours to fly to New Orleans to take a carnival cruise in the Caribbean with his daughter. This is the other weird thing. It's like, what? So on the outside of this, they have relatively normal lives.
Yeah.
But they have like this secret life.
Yeah, Dennis Rader was similar. You know, he had a family, 2 kids. None of the family knew anything about what he was doing, but he would go and commit these horrific crimes. He would often hide stuff in his parents' basement and then go home and, live this apparently, kind of normal-ish life. I mean, not entirely normal, but, he made a good, show of just being a family man who had a job, and Israel Keys is a terrifying example of that because, on the face of it, he just seemed like, a kind of good guy. People liked him. He was relatively attractive. He had a business as a contractor, and woodworker. But he's pursuing this whole second career, essentially, um, and we know so very little about what he did. I mean, I think he had many victims, but we only know the identities of 3 of them.
Yeah, he returns to her. This is after a paragraph of all the other tying her up and so on. Returns at 3 a.m., ties her up with ropes more elaborately as a form of bondage, and then rapes her slowly twice. Then he puts on leather gloves and strangles her. He stabs her in the back with a knife, but it wasn't to make her die faster, he'll say later. It was something else. He tidies up, rolling the body in a sleeping bag and tarp, concealing it in a cabinet, and locked the shed. At 5 a.m., he takes a taxi to the airport and leaves for his cruise. Now, how do you know all these? You have so much detail. These are from the police reports after they're captured?
Israel Keys was interviewed at some length by the FBI and authorities in Alaska, and he described what he did to Samantha Koenig, um, basically as he was trying to work out a kind of plea agreement whereby he wanted to be executed very rapidly. This, of course, didn't work out for him, and it probably never would have worked out because that's not how the system works. But that's what he was trying to do, and he described what he did to her in detail. He also described the murder of a random married couple who he abducted and tortured and raped and murdered in Vermont. But those I think they know the identity of another woman who he murdered in New York State. He owned a piece of property up there. But aside from that, the identity of every other victim of his is either not known or is a cause for speculation. Um, and he really didn't divulge very much in these conversations with the FBI, and then, of course, he committed suicide under circumstances that are really expose the incompetence of the, judicial and jail system up in
Mm,
Anchorage, and the fact that he, was basically allowed to do that practically, because they gave him a razor blade to shave with
right,
is
right.
just extraordinary.
It is. Well, like the Epstein suicide. I think he probably killed himself, but there's enough murkiness, and I think
Yeah.
incompetence is a better explanation than a conniving plot by powerful people to silence him. Because why wouldn't they do the same to Ghislaine Maxwell? She knows everything Epstein knew, right? So
Yeah.
anyway,
Good point.
I, I should point out also other theories. On the right, it's a decline of religion or the decline of marriage, the decline of traditional Judeo-Christian values, that sort of thing. None of which is held up even in correlational studies. On the left, income inequality and poverty also, not well correlated because sometimes the crime rates go up when the economy is up, and so on. Like anyway, so another quirky one of these out of left field is the whole Project MK Ultra by the CIA of dosing people as mind control experiments. You probably read Tom O'Neill's book Chaos.
I
Uh,
did, yes,
yes.
with
What did you think
great
about that? Okay,
fascination.
the thesis is that so here's the problem to explain. How did Charles Manson get those women to commit these horrible murders? He wasn't even there. He just told them to go do it. It must have been some, Jedi mind control thing that he was part of the CIA. He was an operative of the CIA or part of that MK Ultra program or connected to it somehow. I don't know. What do you think about all that?
Well, it's a fascinating book. I think it goes down a lot of rabbit holes, it goes off on a lot of different tangents, many of which are fascinating. I mean, as a book, I
Hmm.
think it's quite successful. As a
Gripping. Yeah.
theory, I'm not so sure because I mean,
Yeah.
he does bring up some very valid points about um, the misleading information in the book, Helter Skelter, by Vincent
Yes.
Bugliosi and the other fellow whose name I'm not remembering. But that I think is really valuable reporting, and I admire very much all the work that he did to try and track down all this information about what Manson was involved in San Francisco and the connections to the MK Ultra stuff, which are, remain one of the, the most bizarre chapters in, you know, scientific history in this
Hmm.
country in terms of, the stuff that was being done and the connections to Ted Kaczynski, I think, are incredibly
Hmm.
bizarre um, and worth writing about. But ultimately, it sort of is such a complicated story to tell that it's um, really kind of goes off the rails a little bit because there are just so many, goes off into the weeds a little bit at various points. But I understand the problem. So,
There's now a Netflix doc based on it called Chaos, based on the book,
right.
and he's
Yeah.
featured in it. It is gripping stuff. I mean, there are a lot of weird things like the Manson's parole officer kept letting him go.
Yeah.
It's like you
Yeah.
just crime after crime after crime. No, no, go ahead, go.
Yeah.
We need you to go out there and be free. What?
Yeah, and I think that he makes a fairly good case that Manson may have been an informer to some agency or another,
Right,
to
right.
earn those kinds of, second, third, fourth, fifth chances.
Yes.
Um, But there's
On the other
also
hand,
a level of incompetence by the
yes,
police that just
yes.
really failed to put things together.
Well, it's like the Ted Bundy case where he's gonna represent himself
Right.
in the trial, and then he says, "Well, I need to be alone in this room upstairs to prepare my notes." Oh, okay, go ahead. And then he
Yeah.
jumps out the window and runs off into the mountains. It's like, what are these people thinking? They know what he
Yeah.
did.
Yeah, and it's funny, but it's also horrifying because,
Yes.
he escapes once and they don't learn from that this guy is really good at
Yeah.
escaping. We need to put him under, much better lock and key in terms of controlling him. And they allow him to escape again, and he goes to Florida and commits these other horrific murders and attacks on women. And as far as I'm concerned, Colorado is almost as responsible as Ted Bundy for
Mhm.
what he did there because they had him. They should have kept him where he was.
Astonishing. Yeah. Just, yeah, incompetence, I think, explains a lot. I had a guy writing me back in the 90s. We were doing an issue of Skeptic on the death penalty, and he wanted to make the case against the death penalty because he was on death row. I think it was in Maine for murdering women. He's like one of these
Mm,
guys you write about. I forget his name now, but he describes, so just writing back and forth. I said, just tell me what you did. What's in your head? And he said, I just have this compulsion. When I see a woman, I just want to rape and kill her. He said, even after my trial, I'm convicted. I'm going to prison. That's it. I'm in the van, locked to the seat or whatever. And we're driving down the road to the other prison. And I see a woman on the sidewalk walking. And all I can think is, how can I get out of this van so I can attack this woman? And basically he said, don't ever let me out. I just don't want to be executed, but don't
yeah,
let me out because we just have to separate these people from the
yeah.
rest of us.
Some of these guys do have that kind of insight, if you call it that, into their own behavior. I mean, Ed Kemper, I think, said something like the same thing, that he he couldn't control it, and he was never caught. He gave himself up. I mean, he
Mm,
called the police from a phone booth, I think, and told them to come and get him, and they didn't even want to arrest him, because they didn't understand that he had committed all these crimes. But he basically, when interviewed in prison, said virtually the same thing, that I can't control it. I
hmm
think that's true of Ted Bundy too. If he had managed to escape from Florida, which he gave it the old college try, he definitely would have killed somebody else, I'm pretty sure.
Oh, yeah. What do you make of those? Now there's these either Amazon Prime or Netflix of these tapes, the Ted Bundy tape and the Jeffrey Dahmer tapes. And, when they're confessing at the last moment to avoid execution, how do you know if what they're saying is true?
Well, I think there's a wide variety of different degrees of reliability among those kinds of things. The Bundy talked a lot about himself in the third person, and a lot of that seems to be borne out by the journalism. It seems to be fairly accurate, although God knows he was a liar. I mean, he was somebody who lied constantly and wouldn't really admit what he did up until the very last hours, days of his life. Um, but Son of Sam, for example, you'd mentioned him earlier. He gave all kinds of confessions to law enforcement that were then kind of brought into question. The thing about the dog telling him to do it, and he did make, I think, an attempt to portray himself as insane. And that seems to have been an act to some extent. Then you have somebody like Dennis Rader, who, like, basically from the time he was arrested, they couldn't shut him up. I mean, he just went on and on and on. And, not just to law enforcement, but then some years later to Catherine Ramsland, who's one of the scholars who's written quite a bit about serial killers, and she interviewed him by phone. And some of that stuff seems to be fairly accurate. Some of it is now in question because they have discovered, for example, several earlier murders, victims that he did not admit to, possibly because of the death penalty. Um, and so now we have to kind of go back and look at what he said about what he did and in light of new revelations. So, I think it varies enormously.
Hmm. And then you have people that confess to crimes they didn't do.
That's right. Yeah.
And that's even weirder.
Yeah, there's that one, I'm forgetting his name off the top of my head, but he became in Texas, the serial killer became quite infamous. I mean, he basically copped to, hundreds of murders, and the more they looked into it, the more they could tell that he was just lying about all this stuff, um, and it may have been some combination of mental illness, and something else, desire for attention, which seems to be a big factor for these guys.
Status,
Yeah,
status among my colleagues, the other
that's
killers.
right. I think many of them
Unbelievable.
do consider it a kind of
Hmm.
career, and they are proud of their accomplishments.
Yeah, I was just following the Kohlberger case. He got out of the death penalty by confessing to killing those 4 students. But the frustrating thing about that is, why can't they then make him say, "Why did you do it?" Or just tell us what was going on in your head or whatever.
Well, they can, and I don't understand why that was not done in that case. I mean, that was what they required, for example, of Dennis Rader when he pled guilty, was to confess to all of the crimes. He had to explain what he'd done, um, and I think that the judge was allowed to ask him questions, as they proceeded through the whole horrible, list of the crimes that he was confessing to. And so the judge in that case in Idaho could have required, him and the prosecutor could have required him to talk about those, issues as part of the plea agreement, and I don't understand why that wasn't done, because obviously it's very, very upsetting to, the families and to the public at large.
Yeah, totally. I mean, everybody wants to know.
Yeah.
But maybe there's no good answer. Maybe it's like, I don't know. I just decided to do it. I walked in, I was just going to kill the one, and then there was somebody else, so I just went crazy. There may not be a satisfactory answer. I mean, what we want to explain evil is some deep, causal mechanism like what we're talking about today. But the killers themselves may not have
It's
honest
true.
knowledge about their own motives.
It's true, and, somebody like Bundy who had some interesting things to say about, I quote some of the things he said about how it started so early for him, and he felt like there was something wrong with them. He felt like there might have been some sort of environmental,
Hmm.
contribution, but he didn't know what it was. Yeah, I don't think he knew why he did what he did, and that late, uh, talk that he gave to Dobson, James Dobson, where he claimed it was because of pornography, think
Oh, right.
I think it's just
That's right.
ridiculous. He was, just trying to say, uh, "I did it because, society I was exposed to
Right.
these terrible things, and it made me do it, and that's ridiculous."
Like the Twinkie defense. It was the
That's
blood
right.
sugar
Yeah.
level.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, with evil, like Hannah Arendt's, the banality of evil, there's Eichmann sitting in the box, and it's like, well, he just looks like a normal dude, just a nobody, a bureaucrat.
Yeah.
How is this possible?
And he was a bureaucrat. I
He
mean,
was a
that
bureaucrat,
was
yeah.
his
Yeah.
real skill set was,
Yeah.
kind of keeping track of all these elements of the project that was underway. But yeah, I mean, there is when you look at what they've done versus who they are, there's this terrible disconnect,
Hmm.
because you want to see them as some kind of satanic, um, monster, but in fact, it's much more likely that they're just a schlub, or a
Hmm.
coward, or they're not somebody who whose appearance or behavior in any way correlates to the horrific stuff that they've actually perpetrated.
Have you seen those photos from the Auschwitz album of the families living just off site and near Auschwitz? And they're
Yes,
just,
from that memoir and the
the kids
movie.
are
Yeah,
playing on the swings and they're just having picnics, and just
yeah,
100 meters away there's the gas chambers. It's
yeah.
just
And I mean that has played out in some ways. I mean, right now in this country, we have, places where they're taking immigrants and the
mm.
alligator
Oh, right,
Alcatraz or whatever they
right,
call it. I mean,
right.
just these sort of horrific things, or the prison system, which
Hmm.
in various states has been exposed as extremely um, inhumane, the things that are being done to people in these prisons. And, it's just the people who work there are not somebody you would identify as, brutal or, um, inhumane if you saw them in shopping in Walmart or something like that. I mean, and yet
Right.
they're going to their job and they're doing things that should never be done.
Oh, the prison system here, oh, it's so horrible. See all those hidden camera videos or just
Yeah.
testimonials about what it's like to work there, how badly the people are treated, the violence, sexual violence, physical violence. If I ever got in trouble and did something where I thought I would just spend all the money I have on the best lawyers I could possibly find. I would hire Johnny Cochran if he was still alive. He got OJ off.
He did. He did.
You ever
I
seen that?
talked to him once because I
You
was a
did?
fact checker at the New Yorker, um,
Oh.
in that whole, era, and needed to contact him to check some material about the OJ case and so forth. He was a charming guy, very
I bet
charming
he
and
was,
and
yes.
funny.
Chris Rock has that riff where he says, basically what I just said. He said, I'd hire Johnny Cochran. And then his friends go, yeah, but then people will think you're guilty. He goes, yeah, but you get to go home.
True, true.
So, yeah, by the way, there's another Netflix. You could tell I watch a lot of Netflix. Another one on OJ, 4 parts. And basically reiterating everything we know. But they had an interesting interview in part 4 with his agent, his ex-agent, obviously,
Mm.
who was so after the verdict. They were, and then after the not guilty verdict, and then OJ owed a lot of money to the IRS, I guess, so he had to sell the Rockingham home.
Mm.
And so this agent is over there. They're still kind of buds, and they're packing stuff up and reminiscing about the old days. And so he says, I asked OJ, what happened that night? And OJ said, what do you think happened? And the agent guy is like, okay, I could be honest. I could do the typical agent thing and go, oh, I know you would never do such a thing. I said, but I think I'll just be honest. OJ, I always thought you did it. And he said, OJ kind of looked off and then said, you know what? If Nicole hadn't come to the door with a knife that night, she'd still be alive.
Oh,
You can
wow.
watch that clip. It's on YouTube also,
Wow.
but it's in part 4 of that series on Netflix. So my sense of that is that, is OJ a murderer? Well, what do you mean by murder? Yeah, he killed 2 people, so he's a murderer, but it's not like he's walking around for decades like looking to murder somebody. We know he was violent. He was a stalker. And
Yeah.
we know he went over to the house a lot to spy on her. And because there's all those 911 calls where you could hear him pounding and screaming at the door, and she's like, he's back, and so on. So he probably went over there that night and saw
Yeah.
her with, Ron Goldman, good looking guy. He probably just had a jealous fit, screaming and yelling. She probably grabbed a knife to protect herself, and then bam. That's my take on it.
Yeah, I mean, he seems to have been a, committed many instances of domestic abuse prior to that, and should have been probably arrested, before uh,
Yeah.
before he murdered um,
Yeah.
them. But yeah, I mean, it's just a horrific case, but so fascinating in terms of the history that fed into his acquittal.
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, it was a conspiracy theory, that the police planted the bloody glove and the other evidence.
Yeah.
And another series on ESPN, OJ in America, showed that in fact the relationships between the police in LA and African Americans in the 50s and 60s was really bad. I mean, very racist. They did plant evidence. They did arrest people without
Sure.
cause and so on. A lot of that. So by the time the jury hears this, it's like, yeah, I don't know about this case, but yeah, they do
Yeah.
stuff like that. And that's and
Yeah,
after,
and clearly it was felt to be by certain, parts of the African American community to be like, this is a justice,
right.
whether he did it or not. This is some kind of justice for us
Yes.
because of so many of the abuses that have taken place. And you can understand that
Yeah.
feeling. I mean, I don't think it's right, but you can certainly understand the feeling that was expressed then.
Yeah, I had the podcast episode with the famous sports commentator Jim Lampley, who did all the boxing stuff and 14 Olympics and so on. So he knew OJ really well and
Mhm.
Nicole and spent time at their home and so on. And so I asked him about that, OJ, and he's like, you would never believe that he could have done it. I just could not believe it. This is the nicest guy, the most fun guy you've ever
Yeah,
been with. And he goes, I'm watching the trial unfold. I'm like, holy crap, he did it. Oh my God, I
yeah.
can't ever be friends with this guy. I mean, that's it. Wow. But
Yeah, and a
why?
lot of these, serial killers are like that too. People just could not. I mean, Dennis Rader's daughter, that she wrote a book about, the horrific discovery that her father was the BTK killer. Um, and how it was just almost impossible for her and her family to believe it. Ted Bundy was the same. I mean, it was just there were so many people, including Ann Rule, who had worked with them at the Rape Crisis Center, to believe that he could ever have done, what he did. So it's yeah, I mean, the whole history of lying in both in my book and just in the lives of these guys is sort of a fascinating thing because, it you can see it not just in the serial killers, but also in the behavior of a lot of the corporate actors that I'm talking about, Asarco and these smelter officials who just lied and lied and lied about what they were doing. They lied to the communities, they lied to parents, they lied to state officials and other authorities and just the behavior just mirrors, the, you know, I mean, there's a lot of talk in our society now about type A individuals, people who are the heads of corporations or CEOs or whatever. And I think we need to be really concerned about some of these people,
Yeah.
whether they're
Right.
technology guys or what have you. There's a real lack of morality.
Well, you made the comparison of the Guggenheims to the current Sackler family and Purdue Pharmaceutical. They knew that these were
Yeah,
addictive and deadly, and
yeah.
they didn't care. I had a podcast guest years ago, Kevin Dutton. He's a Scottish, I think, neuroscientist, and his book was on psychopathy, but the other side of psychopathy. There's the psychopaths like we've been talking about, but if you're not a serial killer kind of guy, you could become a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and
Sure.
your skill set is really good for that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think
Fearless, you
we're
don't care what other people think. Who cares about laws? We're just going to plow through and do our thing.
that's right, and you see that now in all this AI, development, that there's complete unwillingness to grapple with the dangers of this stuff, what it might mean if AI goes out of control, but in a less sci-fi kind of way. There's a refusal to address the environmental cost, the water, the air, the places where they're building these giant server farms. Um, you know, and
They have to
and
be air conditioned.
yeah, and just they just want what they want, and they don't care about the consequences. They don't care about the neighbors of these server farms. They don't care about the effects of these AI things that hallucinate and encourage people to kill themselves. I mean, it's really just an extraordinary example of what you're talking about, psychopathy.
Yeah. Well, there's that image of Zuckerberg's forthcoming server building that's like 80% the size of Manhattan. I mean, a single building. You
Yeah.
can see it from space, no problem.
It's really concerning.
Got to be a huge environmental footprint.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that also shows that a lot of special forces guys are also high in psychopathy, maybe
Yeah.
Machiavellianism, narcissism. I mean, but in a way, that's the kind of person you want to do those hard deeds that no one else can do, right? He tells this funny story about this was the UK's version of the Navy SEALs. So they put him through the training, and the last test is they got this guy like down on the ground, blindfolded, and he can barely move. And then they fire up this big truck engine, and they roll this huge tire right up to his head. And if he doesn't flinch, if he's just like, I'm cool, it's like, that's our guy.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Now go off there
Oh,
and kill these people in this foreign country because,
yeah.
most people don't want to do that. They can't do that.
Yeah, but now you're seeing it here, in these, we've seen a lot of behavior by cops that is really off the rails. Now we're seeing this with ICE officials, guys who are just being empowered to do whatever they think is appropriate in the moment. And they have masks on and yeah, I mean, I think that there's got to be a percentage of and we see this in law enforcement too, of guys who get into this for the wrong reasons because they want to act out aggression. They want to be violent, um, as opposed to any kind of, uh, you know, motivation that involves, real moral considerations of right and wrong
Well, there
and
you'd
how
probably go
to,
into the criminal justice system or be a lawyer or something like that.
yeah,
But if you
yeah.
want to be out on the street, I mean, you do have to have a little bit of a badass attitude, or else it would just be so anxiety producing to be constantly on alert like that. Maybe some people just like that.
Yeah, it's a really troubling area, and I think that,
Yeah, yeah,
there are countries where the police are not armed, and
that's it.
that, I
Yeah.
think, is something that makes a lot more sense than what we're involved in here.
All right, Caroline, we've been going on for about an hour and 45 minutes. So I'm going to wrap it up. I didn't get to ask you about God's perfect child, but just briefly, you were raised in Christian Science Church, right?
Yeah, yeah, I was, and, it's a bizarre and fascinating history, and if you're interested in the origins of the laws that are currently empowering the ignorance about vaccines and the laws that enable people to, uh, deny vaccines to their kids. It all started with the Christian Science Church.
That's right. They don't believe in the germ theory of disease, right?
They don't believe in the human body. They don't believe in the reality of the material world.
I see. It's all a form of spiritual
It's all an
something,
illusion.
all an
Yeah.
illusion. Yeah. Would you consider them a cult now looking back?
Cult is kind of one of those words like
Yeah.
evil that I think
Right.
doesn't necessarily bring us a lot of enlightenment. But
Yeah.
sure, I mean, they're a religion, but they're also behave in some ways like a cult. They don't live communally, which is one of the things that distinguishes a lot of cults where people are all living in the same building or compound or something like that. So they're different than that in some ways, but
And a female
um,
leader, that's also unusual.
yeah, although not so unusual in the US. The Seventh-day Adventists, for example, were started by a woman, Ellen White, and
That's right. Yes.
um, and there are others. Um, so it may have been something to do with that era in US
Yeah.
history.
And how do you think being raised in that affected your, I don't know, your psychology or your pathway in life?
I think it made me very skeptical,
You're a good skeptic. Yes.
to use a word that you're familiar
Yes.
with.
Nice. All right, Carol, I'm going to let you go. Anyway, here it is again, Murderland. It's a great read. It's a really good audio. The reader of the audiobook did a great job.
Yes, a lot of people have told me that, so
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
glad.
Yeah.